Washington has the longest streak of any state in the union for electing Democratic governors. In fact, Washington hasn't sent a Republican to the governor's mansion since 1980. So this has an unbroken chain of Democratic rule going back to 1985. So it's very odd that some people in the political sphere think that this could potentially be the Republicans' break into the office of governor. And as we look at the breakdown of Washington's politics, some of the circumstances surrounding this election, it begins to be kind of clear that what seems a little bit ridiculous on the face of it isn't so far-fetched. So that's what we're going to talk about in today's video. We're also going to talk about what a Republican coalition in Washington would look like. So obviously we're going to take a look at the most recent statewide victory for Republicans, which was Kim Weinman's victory for the Secretary of State position back in 2020. So Washington has a history of split ticket voting. And in fact, the office of Secretary of State was basically under unbroken Republican control from the 1960s all the way to 2021 when Kim Weinman resigned to be part of the Biden administration. So we're going to get to all of that in just a second. But first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So Washington State is a fast-growing state. It's one of the fastest-growing blue states in the country. But because of this, you obviously have some of the challenges that a fast-growing state coupled with unbroken Democratic rule brings you. Of course, high crime, high inflation, high cost of living. You have drug problems in and around Seattle, homelessness. So all of these are basically coming to the forefront in this year's gubernatorial race. Now, the candidate to win this blanket primary, if you're a Republican and you want a shot at winning statewide, is Dave Reichert. He's a former congressman from the 8th Congressional District, and he previously served as the King County Sheriff, which King County is home to Seattle. It's the bluest county in the state. And he had held that office from the 1990s all the way to the mid-2000s. So, you know, that could be a lifetime in politics, but at that time, King County was still relatively Democratic. And of course, now it's the bluest county in the state. But nonetheless, this gives Reichert some unique name recognition in a blue stronghold that other Republican candidates on the ballot wouldn't have. Now, interestingly enough, Washington has a similar system to the state of California, where instead of each party nominating their respective candidate, there's basically a blanket primary, and the voters pick. And the top two vote getters on this blanket primary become the two candidates for governor. And according to the polls, Bob Ferguson, the incumbent attorney general, and Dave Reichert, former Republican congressman and sheriff, are the top two in this poll. None of the other candidates come seemingly close. Now, there was actually a lot of drama surrounding the Republican Party of Washington and the endorsement process here, because the Republican Party in Washington is basically controlled by a very MAGA wing of the GOP, and as a result, they were backing Semi Bird, who is the MAGA choice for governor. Now, obviously, this candidate has absolutely zero chance at winning. Dave Reichert is somebody who's much more centrist, has a record of bipartisanship, again, served as sheriff in one of the bluest counties in the state. And, you know, it seems like the Republican Party there, which, again, had been controlled by this MAGA faction, didn't really care about winning the election. So there was this whole back and forth whether or not to endorse Byrd or Reichert. Most of the people in the Washington GOP wanted to endorse Byrd. And long story short, the party ended up not endorsing any of the candidates for a variety of reasons. So that gives Reichert a fundamental advantage because he already has name ID in the Seattle area, but also statewide because he was a congressman. He served in office before. Semi Bird doesn't have that sort of name recognition, but again, if somehow he ends up being the nominee, he's going to lose to Bob Ferguson by a pretty large amount. Now, Dave Reichert, on the other hand, is the electable choice for governor, and in fact, when we look at some of the head-to-head polls, he's actually leading Bob Ferguson by a decent amount. Now, I don't really take any stake in these polls. There's a huge chunk of undecideds. The sample size is very small. They're coming from either Democratic internals or Echelon Insights, which are not really exactly the most reliable polls. You know, a poll that has Ferguson up by 6, I could certainly believe. And as we're going to talk about later in this video, Washington does tend to split ticket a fair amount. Now, Washington is one of a handful of states that actually chooses their governor the same year as the presidential election. So usually a state as blue as Washington is going to have a Democratic boost for the gubernatorial nominee because the top of the ticket is going very blue. and the governorship, other statewide offices getting elected this year, those candidates are going to be dragged over by the Democratic nominee, because we live in an era nowadays in politics where there's a lot less split ticket voting. Now, again, Washington is a bit of an exception, but in most of the country, you look at other states that elect their governors the same time as presidents. I think of Delaware, for example. That's a state that hasn't had a Republican governor in a very long time. And usually the gubernatorial results are very closely resembling the presidential result. Washington is the exception to this, however, and Washington, as recently as 2020, as we talked about earlier, elected a Republican to statewide office, Kim Weinman, who won her race for Secretary of State, winning the state by 7 points, while Donald Trump lost the state by 19. Again, on the exact same ballot. And if you take a look at the county breakdown, she's bringing the Democrat under 60% in King County, which if we pull up the 2020 results, Joe Biden got 75% of the vote here. So there's a lot of split ticket voting going on, especially in this sort of Seattle urban core of the state. The rest of the state obviously is trending more Republican, but some of these counties have much smaller shifts than the bluer counties in and around Seattle. These are the areas where the population is growing the most and where you have obviously the biggest concentration of Democratic voters. So, Kim Weinman's ability to win in these areas is obviously very impressive. And the fact that this was a lean R race back in June of 2020, Washington Republicans are quite used to this. But usually they're winning lower level races like treasurer or secretary of state. As we talked about in the beginning of this video, they haven't won the governorship since 1980. But, Dave Reichert, I think, is a pretty strong candidate. He has the right messaging on the issue of abortion. And he talks about how he's personally pro-life, but how he'd never really take legislative action. And if there was some sort of abortion ban that came to his desk, he would put it up to a vote, and that vote would 100% err on the side of the pro-choice factions. I think his messaging is good on that. He's really focusing on a tough-on-crime image, which I think is important because there's a massive crime wave going on in Seattle. You have homelessness, drugs, all these big problems. And Seattle, a couple years ago, actually elected a Republican as its district attorney. And that's really huge because Seattle is a big Democratic progressive city. Joe Biden's probably getting 85% of the vote there, and yet you have a Republican on the ballot winning the attorney general's race. Now, granted, the opponent there was a pretty radical far left Democrat, but that goes to show you that even some Democratic voters eventually get fed up with high crime rates, and they go towards the candidate that actually wants to do more to prosecute violent crime. And that's something that I think Reichert should focus on heavily. I think he should take some notes from the Lee Zeldin campaign in New York. What issues worked, what didn't. Reichert also really doesn't have a close connection to Trump in any way. He basically disavowed him in the 2016 election, said he wasn't voting for him in 2024. So I think he's positioned himself very well to actually win here statewide. Now, again, it's still a struggle because this is Washington and this office has been Democratic for so long. But as recently as 2012, you had a Republican almost win the governorship here. Bob McKenna got 48.8% of the vote against Jay Inslee's 51.2%. Again, this is on the exact same ballot that Maria Cantwell is winning by over 20 points in the Senate race. Barack Obama is winning the state by 14 points on the presidential ballot. So there's a lot of split ticket voting happening in Washington, which I think should encourage a lot of Republicans, especially if they can really rein in the MAGA faction and get them under control in the state party, because Dave Reichert is somebody who I think is a no-brainer choice. He's somebody who absolutely can win statewide. Again, you have probably voter fatigue from Democratic rule in Washington. Again, every time there seems to be an open seat for governor, the results get fairly close. We saw that in 2004 with Dino Rossi only losing by around 100 votes or so, which that election has all sorts of litigation issues and is very controversial because Dino Rossi in the first two recounts was declared the winner, and then in the third recount, the Democrat was declared the winner. So that race is obviously very controversial, but every time there's an open seat, there is the opportunity for Republicans to do very well. And 2012 was the last time we had an open seat for governor in Washington, and the Republican almost won. Again, on the same ballot that the Senate candidate for the Democrat is winning by over 20 points, Barack Obama winning by 14. So I think it's absolutely possible that Reichert, provided he runs the right campaign, gets the right funding, could win statewide in Washington. Now, it certainly is an uphill battle. I think Ferguson at this point the race probably is likely in his direction. He probably wins by high single digits, maybe 10 points at this point. But I think that barometer is going to move as we get closer to the election, as the issues get fleshed out more, because governor's races are very different from presidential races. And while a lot of times voters are less likely to split ticket during presidential years, midterm elections, you tend to see that more because those voters are definitely more involved. Washington has a history of this, as we pointed out. You've had a 7-point Republican win on the same ballot as a 19-point Republican loss. I think on a message of crime, the economy, inflation, homelessness, and you focus on those statewide issues and don't nationalize this race, you certainly could see Dave Reichert potentially pull it off. Now, as I've said, this is likely Democratic, but of course the Democrats are already trying to nationalize this race because that's how they win, because Washington is going to go for Joe Biden fairly comfortably. It's just a matter of getting all those Biden voters to also vote for Bob Ferguson. And not all of them are going to, but you need, 80, 90%, whatnot, to win. So that's something the Democrats are focused on, trying to get Reichert tied to Trump and obviously the Republicans' anti-abortion position. But, if the Republican sticks to the bread and butter issues, talks about local issues, gets sort of the right endorsements from the right people, runs the right campaign, you could potentially see a Republican win the governorship in Washington for the first time in about 40 years, which would be obviously incredible and, earth-shattering political news. But again, for a state that tends to vote for Republicans statewide anyway, it shouldn't be too surprising. But in today's very polarized climate, a state like Washington electing a Republican for the highest office in the state would obviously send shockwaves through Democratic circles. But we're going to monitor this race as it goes on. Again, the primary is being held in August, so we have 2 months really before we find out who the nominees are and how the campaigns are going. Ferguson and Reichert are essentially campaigning as if they're already the nominee because, according to the polls, they're by far the favorites to win. But obviously nothing is guaranteed, and there's still 2 months before the primary election. Of course, after that, we'll talk more about this race as we get more general election polling. Anyway, that's it for today's video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification so you miss any more videos I put out. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.